Okay, so it's the same day as my failed haikus, and I decided that in order to continue with this process, I had to begin learning how to teach myself poetry. Um, in the slides before, you'll see that there's a lot of unfinishedness with the haikus and very dry writing when it comes to the free verse. The whole plan is to have a couple poems in the end, but I'm not gonna lie, this creative process is very much dragging because I'm not a creative writer. I don't do creative writing whatsoever. I love to read. I'm the reader. So, besides that, research number one. Using intercultural rhetoric to teach poetry, an innovative way of reading to task students building critical thinking. That is the name of the peer-reviewed journal article that I picked. It's by Arilanto. I'm so sorry if I butchered that last name. And within this article, they express the intercultural rhetoric connected back to critical thinking. So, what is intercultural rhetoric? It's a study of written discourse between and among individuals within different cultures and backgrounds. So, why does this connect to poetry? I think the best way to describe it is poetry is relatable. And in order to understand and interpret poetry, we have to relate to it in some sense. And it's pretty beneficial that it would come from a different individual of a different race, sexuality, or religion, etc. Any type of different individual to then challenge to challenge us, the reader, to think critically and break it down. So in this article, it explains that teaching the writer versus the reader's interpretation is poetic rhetoric. So what I think is influential in my poem, or what I think is the main idea of my poem, may not necessarily be the same for you when you read it, Professor Greenwald, is what I'm understanding. Which is normally how literature goes anyways. Literature is so interpreted by so many different people, different walks of life. Therefore, it's not going to be the same interpretation for everyone, and that's where critical thinking comes into play. So, like I said, critical thinking is like thinking outside of yourself, being more reflective of maybe the author's intent rather than your own personal interpretation. So it's beyond the level of literal comprehension to comprehending the more complex and subtle features within a literary work. So we're reading through the lines. That's what poetry is, reading through the lines. How am I going to put this into practice? I have to make something. I have to craft something that is, it interprets maybe one meaning to me as the writer, but has multiple ideas or ways of interpretation. This is the author expresses that this is super extremely difficult for an individual who simply does not know how to think critically whatsoever. And then I wrote, side note, what does it mean to think critically, to analyze, to assess, to deconstruct and reconstruct, to communicate, and to be open-minded. And I really liked this specifically because of its cultural rhetoric connection. Because in order to understand cultural rhetoric, you have to think critically, vice versa. And this is where IR, Reading Task Intervention for Poetry, is created for creative writing. So it initiates the students' IR-based reading and then develops their understanding of the poetry. So within the slides after this, you'll see charts in which the students are supposed to fill out in order to understand poetry. I will be doing this for one of the poems I picked from either the Poet-X or Her, a novel, or I should say a book of poems from a specific author. So you're going to see that put into work in just a second. But yeah, that's research number 1. I'm taking their task for critically analyzing and reading poetry. That way I can take some inspiration and possibly make a free verse poem, because I gave up on haikus. We're not getting those. So this is research number 1. I might review, I think I will be reviewing those charts with the poetry that I chose to dissect. So I'll see you in that video, probably tomorrow.